I thought finding my biological father would give me answers about who I am. Instead, I discovered I have 59 half-siblings I never knew existed, and the man who created us all had turned fatherhood into a twisted game of numbers. Growing up, I always felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit anywhere. My name is Jessica. I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I believed my stepfather Marcus was my biological dad. My mom, Linda, married him when I was 3, and he treated me like his own daughter from day one. He taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, walked me down the aisle at my wedding last year. Marcus was everything a father should be, except for one thing that nagged at me my entire life. I looked absolutely nothing like him. While Marcus had olive skin, dark hair, and brown eyes, I was pale with strawberry blonde hair and green eyes that seemed to change color depending on my mood. My mom always brushed off my questions with vague answers. "You get that from my side of the family," she'd say. But even looking at old photos of my maternal grandparents, the resemblance wasn't there. Had my mom's nose and smile, sure, but everything else seemed to come from nowhere. The questions intensified. When I hit my teenage years, friends would comment on how different I looked from both my parents. "Are you adopted?" became a running joke that stung more than I let on. My mom would get visibly uncomfortable whenever the topic came up, and Marcus would quickly change the subject. I started to suspect there was something they weren't telling me, but I loved them too much to push the issue. They had given me a stable, loving home, and that felt like enough. When I turned 18, I asked my mom directly about my biological father. She sat me down in our kitchen, the same place where we'd had countless heart-to-heart talks over the years, and finally told me the truth. She explained that she had been young and naive when she met my biological father. His name was David Thompson, and according to her, he was charming, handsome, and completely unreliable. She discovered she was pregnant just as he disappeared from her life, leaving no forwarding address or way to contact him. "I tried to find him when you were born," she explained, tears in her eyes, but it was like he vanished into thin air. "Marcus came into our lives when you were a toddler, and he wanted to be your father in every way that mattered. I thought it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." I understood her reasoning, but something inside me still yearned to know where I came from. Not because Marcus was unenough, he was an incredible father, but because there was this empty space in my identity that I could unfill. I wanted to know my medical history, understand my temperament, and maybe even meet David if he was still alive. My mom supported my decision to search for him, though I could see the worry in her eyes. For years, I tried traditional methods of searching. I hired a private investigator who came up empty-handed. I scoured social media, checked public records, and even posted in online forums for people searching for lost family members. David Thompson was apparently a common enough name that I found dozens of possibilities, but none of them matched the limited information my mom could provide. She remembered he was tall, had green eyes like mine, worked in sales, and drove a red sports car that he was incredibly proud of. Beyond that, her memories had faded over the decades. The search became an obsession that my husband Ryan worried was consuming too much of my emotional energy. "You have a family who loves you," he'd remind me gently. Maybe that's enough. But he didn't understand the feeling of walking through the world not knowing half of where you came from. It wasn't about replacing the family I had. It was about completing the picture of who I was. As DNA testing became more popular and affordable, I finally saw a potential solution. For my 27th birthday, Ryan surprised me with one of those Ancestry DNA kits. "Maybe this will give you the answers you've been looking for," he said, wrapping his arms around me as I stared at the small box that might hold the key to my past. I remember feeling both excited and terrified as I spit into that little tube. What if I found relatives who didn't want anything to do with me? What if David had died and I'd never get the chance to meet him? What if I discovered something I wasn't prepared to handle? But the not knowing had become more unbearable than any potential disappointment. So I sealed the package and sent it off, beginning what I thought would be a straightforward journey to find my biological father. The waiting period felt eternal. Every day I checked my email obsessively, hoping for results. I read countless stories online about DNA reunions, some heartwarming, others devastating. I prepared myself for every possible outcome, or so I thought. I imagined meeting a man who looked like me, maybe discovering I had a half-sibling or two, learning about my genetic heritage. I fantasized about David being successful and kind, ready to welcome me into his life with open arms. What I couldn't have imagined was that my simple search for answers would uncover one of the most disturbing family secrets I'd ever heard of. And that the man I was so eager to find would turn out to be someone I'd wish I'd never discovered. The DNA test would reveal not just who my father was, but what kind of person he was, and the shocking scope of his betrayal of dozens of women like my mother. The email notification arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. My hands actually shook as I opened the DNA results on my phone. At first glance, everything seemed normal. I was 42% Irish, 28% German, 18% Scandinavian, and 12% Eastern European. Nothing shocking there. But then I scrolled down to the relative matches section, and my world turned upside down. The list was impossibly long. Instead of finding maybe a few distant cousins like most people do, I had match after match after match of people sharing significant amounts of DNA with me. Close family matches, dozens of them. At first, I thought there must be some kind of error with the system. Maybe my sample got mixed up with someone else's, or there was a glitch in their database. But as I looked closer, the pattern became undeniable. I had over 30 people listed as close family, aunt, uncle, half-sibling level matches. The amount of shared DNA with each person was too significant to be coincidental, and too similar across the board to be anything other than what it appeared to be. These were my half-siblings. I called in sick to work and spent the entire day going through the matches. Each profile that had photos made my stomach drop a little further. I was looking at faces that shared subtle similarities with mine. The same green eyes, similar bone structure, variations of my strawberry blonde hair. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror that reflected dozens of versions of myself. The messaging feature on the DNA site allowed me to contact my matches, so I started reaching out tentatively. My first message was to Emma, a woman in her early 30s who lived in Oregon. I tried to sound casual. "Hi, we're showing up as close family matches. Do you happen to know anything about our connection? I'm searching for information about my biological father, David Thompson." Emma's response came within hours, and it sent chills down my spine. Oh wow, another one. "Yes, David Thompson is my biological father too. I've been in contact with about 15 other half-siblings so far. He's quite the prolific donor, if you know what I mean." "When were you born? Prolific donor?" I stared at her message in confusion. What did that mean? I wrote back asking for clarification, and Emma's next message made my blood run cold. "David runs what he calls a natural fertility clinic out of his home, basically. He advertises online to women who want to get pregnant but can't afford or don't want to use traditional fertility clinics. He offers his services for free, claiming he just wants to help families. But really, he's just a guy who gets off on impregnating as many women as possible. Most of the mothers don't know about each other." I felt sick. The mother hadn't been in a relationship with David. She had been one of his victims. All those years of her describing him as a charming man who disappeared, and the reality was so much more sinister. I immediately called my mom, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd discovered. The silence on her end of the phone lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh God, Jessica, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. He seemed so genuine, so caring. He said he wanted to help me have the baby I'd always dreamed of." Through tears, my mom explained the real story she'd hidden from me for nearly 3 decades. She'd been struggling with infertility in her early 20s, going through expensive and emotionally draining fertility treatments that weren't working. A friend had given her David's contact information, describing him as a private donor who helped women for free. She met with David several times at what she thought was a medical office, but now realized was probably just his house set up to look professional. He had paperwork, medical certificates on the wall, the whole setup, my mom explained. He said he was a medical student who wanted to help couples struggling with fertility. He seemed so professional, so kind. Asked about my health history, my partner preferences, everything you'd expect from a legitimate clinic. The more we talked, the more pieces fell into place. David had told my mom that all his clients signed confidentiality agreements to protect everyone's privacy. He claimed it was standard procedure and that donors typically helped only a few families before retiring from the program. My mom had trusted him completely and never thought to question his motives or investigate his background. Over the next few days, I connected with more and more half-siblings through the DNA site. Oh, yeah. Each conversation revealed the same disturbing pattern. David had been running his scheme for over 20 years, targeting vulnerable women who desperately wanted children. He presented himself as altruistic, professional, and trustworthy, when in reality, he was systematically deceiving dozens of women and creating an army of biological children. Some of my half-siblings had known about David for years and had been trying to warn new matches as they appeared on DNA sites. Others, like me, were just discovering the truth. The age range was staggering. My oldest half-sibling was 31, and the youngest was just 6 years old. David was still actively pursuing his sick hobby. The most disturbing part was learning how he had refined his operation over the years. Early victims like my mom had minimal contact with him, but more recent mothers described ongoing relationships where David would check in periodically, as sometimes even requesting photos of the children. Some women had been convinced to have multiple children with him, thinking they were part of a legitimate donor program. As I processed this information, anger began replacing my initial shock. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about dozens of women who had been manipulated and violated, and dozens of children who deserved to know the truth about their origins. My simple quest to find my biological father had uncovered what I was beginning to realize might be one of the largest fertility fraud cases anyone had ever discovered. After discovering I had dozens of half-siblings, I realized the DNA test I'd already taken was just the beginning of a much larger investigation. The real turning point came when I connected with my half-sister Maria, who had been documenting David's activities for over 3 years. She had created a private Facebook group called Thompson Truth Seekers, where she was collecting evidence and testimonies from victims and their children. Maria was 29, born just 2 years after me, and had the same driven personality that I recognized in myself. When we first spoke on the phone, it felt like talking to a version of myself from another timeline. She explained that she'd started investigating David after her own mother revealed the truth about her conception on her deathbed. My mom was dying of cancer when she finally told me, Maria explained, her voice thick with emotion. She'd carried the guilt for 29 years, convinced that she'd somehow participated in something wrong. She begged me to find the other children and warn their mothers before she passed away. Maria had spent months tracking down David's real identity and location. Unlike my experience, where my mom only knew him as David Thompson, Maria's mother had kept more detailed records. She discovered that David had used multiple names over the years. David Thompson, Dave Thompson, David Thomas, always variations of the same basic identity to make it harder for anyone to track his full scope of activities. Through public records and social media investigation, Maria had located David's actual address in Arizona. She'd even driven past his house, which still maintained the facade of a medical office with professional signage in the yard. He's still doing it, she told me grimly. I found evidence of children born as recently as last year. The Facebook group Maria had created was a revelation. As I read through post after post from my half-siblings, a clear picture emerged of David's methodology. He specifically targeted women in their late teens and early 20s who were struggling with fertility issues. Many were single mothers who couldn't afford traditional fertility treatments. Others were in relationships with men who had fertility problems. David's approach was methodical and predatory. He would advertise discreetly on fertility forums and through word-of-mouth referrals, always presenting himself as a medical professional. He'd meet with potential mothers multiple times to build trust, conduct fake consultations, and make them feel comfortable with the process. Many women described feeling like he genuinely cared about helping them achieve their dreams of motherhood. But the more sinister aspects of his operation became clear as I read more testimonies. Several women reported that David had insisted on natural insemination, rather than artificial methods, claiming it was more effective. Others described feeling pressured or manipulated during the process. Some had been told they were his only client that year, while others were led to believe they were part of a small, exclusive program. Reading these accounts made me physically ill. My mother had been lucky in some ways. Her interactions with David had been minimal and clinical, but other women had been subjected to ongoing manipulation and psychological abuse. Some had been convinced to have multiple children with David, believing they were building families with a legitimate donor who cared about their welfare. The group had documented 43 confirmed half-siblings so far, the ages ranging from 6 to 31, but Maria suspected there were many more who either had untaken DNA tests yet or had unconnected their results. 2. David's activities. The pattern suggested that David had been systematically impregnating women for over 25 years. With his pace actually accelerating in recent years as online fertility forums made it easier for him to find victims, as I absorbed this information, I felt a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at David for his deception and manipulation. There was sadness for all the mothers who had been violated and betrayed. There was confusion about my own identity. Was I the product of a crime? But there was also something unexpected, a sense of connection to this large group of siblings, who shared my experience of growing up not knowing where they came from. The turning point came when Maria asked me a direct question during one of our long phone conversations. "Are you ready to help us stop him?" She explained that several members of the group had been discussing taking legal action against David. They had been in contact with attorneys who specialized in fertility fraud cases, and the consensus was that they had a strong case. But they needed more evidence, more testimonies, and more documented proof of David's ongoing activities. "We think he might have close to 60 children by now," Maria said. "Maybe more. Every month, new people join our DNA matches. This isn't just about our past anymore, Jessica. He's still out there, still preying on vulnerable women who just want to become mothers." I realized that my decision wasn't just about getting personal answers anymore. This was bigger than my individual quest to understand my origins. I was part of something that needed to be exposed and stopped. The DNA test had opened a door I couldn't close, revealing a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. That night, I had a long conversation with Ryan about what I'd learned. He was horrified by David's actions, but worried about the emotional toll this investigation might take on me. "You just wanted to find your father," he said. "Now you're talking about taking on some kind of fertility fraud predator. Are you sure you're ready for this?" I wasn't sure about anything except that doing nothing felt impossible. Somewhere out there, David was probably meeting with another desperate woman, spinning the same lies that had fooled my mother and so many others. The thought of him continuing to create more victims, when I now had the power to potentially stop him, was unbearable. The group was planning to approach David directly before involving law enforcement. The idea was to confront him with the evidence they'd gathered and give him a chance to cease his activities voluntarily. If he refused or continued operating, they would proceed with legal action and media exposure. "I need to see him for myself," I told Maria during our next conversation. "I need to look this man in the eye and understand how someone could do this to so many families." Maria warned me that meeting David might not give me the closure I was hoping for. "Most of us who have confronted him say he's completely unrepentant," she said. "He actually seems proud of what he's done, talks about his children like they're some kind of legacy, like he's done the world a favor by spreading his genes around." But I knew I had to try. The DNA test had started this journey, and I needed to see it through to whatever end awaited. I was about to come face to face with the man whose deception had shaped my entire family's story, and potentially dozens of other families as well. The moment I opened that Facebook group link Maria sent me, I felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. There, laid out in organized chaos, was a family tree unlike anything I could have imagined. Maria had created detailed charts showing all the confirmed half-siblings, their birth years, their mothers' locations, and any information we could gather about David's interactions with each family. Seeing it visualized was overwhelming. I stared at my computer screen for what felt like hours, clicking through profile after profile of people who shared my DNA. There was Thomas in Michigan, born 3 months before me, whose mother had also been told she was David's only client that year. Rebecca in Texas, who looked so much like me that people in the group had initially thought we might be twins separated at birth. Kevin in New York, who had started his own investigation into David after his adopted parents told him the truth about his origins. But it was the timeline that really made my blood run cold. Maria had organized the births chronologically, and the pattern was clear and methodical. David had been impregnating multiple women simultaneously for over 2 decades. In 1998 alone, the year I was born, there were 5 confirmed births. 5 women had given birth to David's children within a 12-month period, each believing she was part of a small, legitimate donor program. The group's research had uncovered David's various personas over the years. In the 1990s, he presented himself as a medical student. In the 2000s, he He claimed to be a fertility specialist completing research. More recently, he'd been marketing himself as a natural fertility consultant, with expertise in holistic conception methods. It's always the same basic lies, refined and updated for each new generation of victims. As I scrolled through the testimonies, certain details kept repeating. Multiple mothers mentioned David's insistence on conducting multiple sessions to ensure success. Several described feeling uncomfortable with his bedside manner, but trusting his claimed expertise. A few had been convinced to have second or even third children with David, believing they were maintaining consistency for their existing child's genetic heritage. The geographic spread was staggering. David had operated across at least 12 states, apparently moving his base of operations every few years. The group had tracked his movements through public records. He'd lived in California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and several other western states. Each time he relocated, he'd establish a new fake practice and begin targeting women in that area. Reading about Emma's experience particularly haunted me. Her mother had been 17 when David convinced her that natural insemination was the only way she'd be able to conceive. Emma was now trying to help her mother process the trauma of realizing she'd been manipulated by a man more than twice her age. "My mom thought she was making a mature decision about her fertility," Emma wrote in the group. "She had no idea she was being groomed by a predator." The medical implications were terrifying too. None of the mothers had received proper screening or genetic counseling. David had provided fake health certificates and made claims about his genetic history that members of the group were now discovering were completely fabricated. Several half-siblings had been born with genetic conditions that David had failed to disclose, suggesting he either didn't know his own medical history or deliberately withheld important information. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came from Lisa, one of my older half-siblings who had actually maintained contact with David over the years. She shared screenshots of recent text messages where David had sent her photos of new additions to the family. Pictures of babies born within the last 2 years. He was still actively pursuing his scheme, and worse, he seemed to view his ever-growing number of biological children as some sort of personal achievement. In one particularly chilling message, David had written to Lisa, "Family reunion is going to need a football stadium soon. Number 58 just arrived last month. Thinking about going for an even 60 before I retire." The casual tone of that message made me feel physically sick. This man was talking about creating human beings like he was collecting baseball cards. Each number represented a life, a family, a woman who had been deceived. The emoji made it even more grotesque. He was literally laughing about his systematic betrayal of dozens of families. Maria explained that the group had been tracking David's communications across multiple platforms. He maintained profiles on fertility forums where he still actively recruited new clients. His current approach was more sophisticated than in the past. He'd created fake credentials and testimonials, and he'd learned to target women who were isolated or desperate enough to overlook red flags. "He's adapted to the internet age," Maria explained during one of our video calls. "He knows how to manipulate women through online interactions before ever meeting them in person. By the time they're ready to meet, he's already established trust and authority." The scope of David's deception became even clearer when we discovered that some mothers had been convinced to sign legal documents waiving their right to child support or future contact. He'd presented these as standard donor agreements, but they were clearly designed to protect him from accountability as his operation grew larger. As I processed all this information, I kept thinking about my mom's face when she told me about David all those years ago. She described him with a mixture of sadness and nostalgia, like he'd been a lost love rather than a manipulative predator. How many other women were carrying similar feelings of romantic disappointment, not realizing they'd actually been victims of a calculated scheme? The DNA results that I'd hoped would provide simple answers about my heritage had instead revealed a family tree that resembled a criminal enterprise. I wasn't just David's daughter. I was evidence of his systematic exploitation of vulnerable women who had trusted him with their most intimate desires for motherhood. Late that night, as I sat staring at the genetic family tree that kept growing every week, I realized that finding David was no longer about satisfying my curiosity. It had become about justice for all the women he'd deceived and protection for the women he might still deceive in the future. The DNA test had revealed not just my biological connections, but a moral obligation I couldn't ignore. Planning the confrontation with David felt like preparing for psychological warfare. The Facebook group had grown to include 47 confirmed half-siblings, and Maria had been in contact with an investigative journalist who was interested in exposing David's operation. But before involving the media or law enforcement, we decided that someone needed to confront him directly and give him a chance to stop voluntarily. I volunteered to be the one to face him, partly because I was one of the newer discoveries, and he wouldn't recognize my name, but mostly because I needed to see this man for myself. I needed to understand how someone could systematically deceive so many families and feel no apparent remorse about it. Maria and I drove to Arizona together, along with 2 other half-siblings who lived nearby. We'd spent weeks preparing for every possible scenario. David might deny everything. He might become aggressive. He might try to manipulate us the same way he'd manipulated our mothers. We had copies of DNA evidence, testimonials from multiple mothers, and legal documentation prepared by attorneys who were ready to file charges if necessary. His house was in a modest suburban neighborhood that looked completely normal from the outside. The medical office signage that several mothers had mentioned was still prominently displayed in the yard. Thompson Natural Fertility Consulting, helping families achieve their dreams. The irony of that slogan made me furious. He wasn't helping families achieve dreams. He was creating nightmares for women who trusted him. When David answered the door, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. I'd built him up in my mind as some kind of monster, but he was just a regular-looking man in his 50s with graying hair and the green eyes I'd inherited. He was shorter than I'd expected, soft around the middle, wearing a polo shirt and khakis like he'd just come home from a golf game. "Can I help you?" he asked, with a smile that I now recognized as the same charming expression that had fooled my mother and so many others. "My name is Jessica," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I think you knew my mother, Linda Martinez, about 28 years ago." The smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. "I'm sorry, that name doesn't ring a bell. Are you sure you have the right person?" Maria stepped forward and handed him a printed copy of our DNA connections. "We're 4 of your biological children, David. We know what you've been doing." I watched his face carefully as he scanned the document. Instead of shock or shame, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Pride. Its expression shifted from confusion to what I can only describe as paternal satisfaction. Like he was looking at a report card showing his children's achievements. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, actually chuckling. "Look how much you've all grown. You're beautiful young women. Your mothers must be very proud." The casual way he acknowledged what we'd discovered was somehow more disturbing than if he'd denied everything. He invited us inside like we were old friends dropping by for a visit, not his victims confronting him about his crimes. His living room was filled with photos, dozens and dozens of baby pictures and school photos that I realized must be images of his. Biological children sent by unknowing mothers over the years. He'd arranged them like a proud grandfather showing off his grandkids, except these were children he'd created through systematic deception. "I've helped create beautiful families," David said as he noticed us staring at the photo display. "Look at all these gorgeous children. Their mothers were struggling, desperate for the gift of parenthood, and I was able to help them. I've given the world amazing human beings." Maria tried to explain the legal and ethical problems with his approach, but David seemed genuinely confused by her concerns. In his mind, he'd provided a service that resulted in healthy children for women who wanted them. The deception, the multiple identities, the lack of proper medical screening, none of that seemed to register as problematic to him. "The traditional fertility industry is cold and expensive," he explained, settling into his recliner like he was giving us a lecture. "I provided a personal touch, real care for these women. Look at the results. Intelligent, healthy children from superior genetic stock." The way he referred to himself as superior genetic stock made my skin crawl. This wasn't someone who had made mistakes or gotten carried away helping people. This was someone who genuinely believed he was performing a service by spreading his DNA as widely as possible. When I asked him directly about my mother, his face lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, Linda. Sweet girl. Very smart. Could tell she'd raise a quality child. How is she doing?" The casual familiarity in his voice when talking about my mom made me want to scream. He was discussing her like she was an old friend he'd lost touch with, not a woman he'd systematically deceived about one of the most important decisions of her life. Our confrontation lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end, it was clear that David felt no remorse for his actions. If anything, He seemed energized by meeting some of his biological children. He asked questions about our lives, our careers, our relationships, acting like a proud father at a family reunion, rather than someone being confronted about fertility fraud. When we explained that we were planning to expose his activities publicly and potentially pursue legal action, David's demeanor shifted slightly. Not to shame or fear, but to defiance. "You can try to paint me as a villain," he said, as we prepared to leave. "But every single one of those women got exactly what they wanted, a healthy baby. Every one of those children got the gift of life. I've created more happiness in the world than most people ever will." As we walked back to our car, I felt emotionally drained and somehow disappointed. I'd expected our confrontation to provide some kind of closure or understanding, but instead, I felt like I'd looked into the mind of someone who was fundamentally disconnected from the impact of his actions on others. David had no understanding that what he'd done was wrong. In his twisted worldview, he was a benefactor who'd helped dozens of families while satisfying his own desire to create as many biological offspring as possible. He saw himself as the hero of every story, not the predator that he actually was. The aftermath of confronting David was more complex than I'd anticipated. While I'd hoped for some kind of resolution or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, what I got instead was the disturbing realization that my biological father was essentially a sociopath, who viewed his systematic deception of vulnerable women as a public service. In the weeks following our visit, the Facebook group exploded with activity. Word spread about our confrontation, and more half-siblings emerged from DNA databases every few days. The number climbed from 47 to 52, then to 58, and finally stabilized at what Maria and I now believe is David's complete count of 60 biological children. The journalists we'd been working with published an explosive that went viral, leading to television interviews and documentary interest. But the media attention, while validating, couldn't fill the emotional void I'd been trying to address when I first sent off that DNA sample. I'd started this journey hoping to find a father figure who could help me understand where I came from. Instead, I discovered that I was the product of calculated manipulation, and that the man who created me was continuing to prey on women just like my mother. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Multiple attorneys worked together to build cases against David in several states where he'd operated. The challenge was that fertility fraud laws were relatively new and varied significantly by jurisdiction. What David had done was clearly unethical and harmful, but proving criminality was more complex than any of us had realized. Some of my half-siblings threw themselves into the legal fight, treating it like a full-time job. Others, understandably, wanted to distance themselves from the entire situation once they'd learned the truth about their origins. I found myself somewhere in the middle, committed to seeing justice done, but also trying to protect my own mental health and marriage from the consuming nature of the investigation. The hardest part was helping my mom process what she'd learned about David. She'd spent nearly 30 years carrying guilt about my father's disappearance, wondering if she'd somehow driven him away or failed to be worthy of his commitment. Discovering that she'd actually been the victim of a predator who never intended to maintain any relationship was simultaneously relieving and traumatizing. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," she told me during one of our many conversations about the situation. But he was so convincing, so professional. How was I supposed to know? Therapy became essential for both of us. Working with a counselor who specialized in genetic identity issues, I began to separate my sense of self from the circumstances of my conception. The revelation about David didn't change who I was or invalidate the loving family that had raised me, but it did require me to reconstruct my understanding of my origins and genetic heritage. One unexpected positive outcome was the relationships I developed with some of my half-siblings. While we'd been brought together by trauma, many of us discovered genuine connections that went beyond our shared genetics. Emma and I started talking regularly about our experiences growing up feeling different from our families. Thomas and I bonded over similar career interests and personality traits that we now realize we'd inherited from David. For better or worse, the group dynamic was fascinating and complex. Some half-siblings embraced the large family concept, organizing meetups and maintaining group chats. Others preferred minimal contact, participating only when necessary for legal proceedings. A few completely disappeared from the group once they'd gotten the basic information about their origins. I found myself drawn to the middle ground, maintaining relationships with about a dozen half-siblings who shared similar approaches to processing what we'd discovered. We supported each other through the media attention, the legal depositions, and the ongoing emotional work of integrating this information into our life stories. David's operation was eventually shut down through a combination of legal action and public exposure. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fertility fraud in 3 different states. The investigation revealed that our count of 60 children was actually conservative. Authorities suspected there might be additional victims who hadn't yet connected their children to David through DNA testing. During the trial, I had to testify about the impact of his deception on my family. Sitting in that courtroom looking at David in handcuffs, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but it couldn't undo the decades of confusion and hurt his actions had caused for so many families. The most powerful moment came when several of the mothers testified about their experiences. Hearing my mom describe how David had preyed on her desperation to become a mother, and seeing similar stories from women across multiple states, drove home the scope of his manipulation. These weren't just individual bad decisions. They were systematic exploitation of women. During some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, David was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to victims. The legal victory felt important, but the personal healing took much longer. I had to learn to separate my identity from the circumstances of my conception, to value the family that had chosen to love me over the man whose genetics I'd inherited. Today, almost 2 years after that first DNA test, I've found a kind of peace with my story. My relationship with Marcus, my stepfather, has actually grown stronger through this experience.